In the spring of 1942, the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service were the most feared aviators in the world. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not sentiment. It is a documented operational fact. At Pearl Harbor, their torpedo and dive bomber crews executed a coordinated strike of a complexity that no other naval air force on Earth had ever achieved. At Coral Sea, their Zero pilots engaged American fighters and walked away from engagements that, on paper, should have been competitive. At Midway, even in catastrophic defeat, their air crews fought with a ferocity and skill that left American commanders shaken. A U.S. Navy pilot who had encountered Japanese naval aviators in the early Pacific War knew one thing above all else: do not try to turn with a Zero. The A6M Zero had a climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute. It could sustain a turn radius that American fighters in 1941 could not match at any altitude. Its 20mm cannons could shred a Grumman Wildcat in seconds. It had a combat range of 1,675 miles, nearly double the range of its early American opponents. When Japanese naval commanders looked at their air arm in 1942, they saw the product of a decade of doctrine, selection, and refinement. They saw the finest carrier-based fighter force ever assembled. 2 years later, 315 of their aircraft were shot out of the sky in a single afternoon. The Americans who did it called it a turkey shoot. They were right, but not for the reasons the nickname suggests. To understand what happened over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, you have to start not with the aircraft, not with the pilots, and not with the tactics. You have to start with the decision the Japanese Navy made in 1940 that made that afternoon mathematically inevitable. A decision that seemed like genius at the time and proved to be the slow-motion destruction of everything they had built. The Japanese naval aviation training pipeline was the most demanding in the world. That sentence is accurate and important, and it is also the first half of a catastrophe. To become a Zero combat pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service in 1941, a candidate underwent a selection process that eliminated the vast majority of applicants before they ever climbed into a cockpit. Physical requirements were exacting. The written examinations were grueling. Of every 1,000 candidates who applied to the Naval Aviation program, approximately 100 were accepted. Of those 100, roughly 75 completed basic training. The survivors then entered a flight curriculum that lasted 2 to 3 years and accumulated by graduation between 600 and 700 flight hours. These were not simulator hours. These were actual hours aloft in multiple aircraft types in all weather conditions with increasingly demanding combat training at every stage. The product of this pipeline was extraordinary. The veterans who flew at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and into the teeth of American resistance over Guadalcanal were, by any objective measure, elite. American pilots who encountered them in 1942 were frequently shocked by the skill displayed, the precision of their gunnery, the audacity of their maneuvers, the composure under fire. But the pipeline produced only 100 to 120 new combat pilots per year. 100 to 120 per year. For the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans read that number and filed it away. The Japanese read it and called it acceptable. That divergence in interpretation is the story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Here is the hidden logic the Zero's reputation concealed. And here is why it took 2 full years before the catastrophe became visible. In 1940, when Japanese naval planners designed the A6M Zero, they made a philosophical decision. They wanted range. They wanted climb rate. They wanted agility. To get those things in the airframe technology available in 1940, they made a trade. They stripped weight wherever they could find it. The Zero had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It had no pilot armor. Its fuel cells were standard rubber bladders, and its cockpit was open to whatever passed through it. The reasoning was elegant in a particular kind of way. The plane would be so maneuverable and the pilots so skilled that they would never be in a position where armor mattered. A Zero would never get hit. This logic was not irrational in 1940. It was a coherent doctrine built on genuine capability. The problem was that the doctrine had no margin for error. It assumed the pilot would always be skilled enough. It assumed the enemy would never develop effective counters. It assumed that the advantages of range and agility would remain decisive indefinitely. Those assumptions required the pilot to be irreplaceable. And the pipeline produced 100 of them per year. Now watch what happens when you lose them faster than you make them. Guadalcanal, August 1942 through February 1943. 6 months of sustained attrition in the skies over the Solomon Islands. The Americans lost pilots. The Japanese lost pilots. But the Americans had something the Japanese did not: a training pipeline that had already been rebuilt. In 1942, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare and naval strategists advising the Navy Department looked at the pilot shortage and pushed through an expansion of the Naval Aviator program that would, within 18 months, produce 30,000 trained combat pilots per year. 30,000. The number is so disproportionate that it requires emphasis. The Americans rebuilt their entire training architecture to produce 250 times as many combat pilots annually as their enemy. But the Americans did something else, something the Japanese missed entirely. They redesigned what trained meant. The Japanese model was artisanal, long apprenticeship, deep skill, individual mastery. The American model was industrial. It had a standardized curriculum, an accelerated timeline, and, critically, the aircraft was redesigned to match the pilot population, not the other way around. In 1942, Grumman delivered the F-6F Hellcat. The Japanese saw it and were unimpressed. They were right to be, given the numbers they were using. The Hellcat was not elegant. It was not particularly graceful. Its empty weight was 9,238 pounds, compared to the Zero's 3,704 pounds. It could not match the Zero's turn radius in a slow-speed horizontal engagement. Its climb rate of 3,600 feet per minute was only marginally better than the Zero's 3,100. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was massive, loud, and extraordinarily thirsty. If you put a Hellcat pilot in a turning dogfight with a Zero at low speed, and both pilots were equivalent in skill, the Zero pilot would probably win. The Japanese knew this. Their intelligence assessments in 1943 acknowledged the Hellcat's superior firepower and noted its heavier airframe. They concluded it was a step forward for the Americans, but not a decisive shift. They were evaluating the aircraft. They should have been evaluating the system. The Hellcat had armor, 212 pounds of cockpit armor plate. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. If a 7.7mm round punched through a wing tank, the synthetic rubber liner would swell and seal the puncture. Its .650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were reliable in conditions where the Zero's 20mm cannons jammed at high altitude. The airframe could absorb punishment that would reduce a Zero to debris. And here is the number that matters most. A Hellcat pilot who was shot at had a dramatically higher probability of surviving long enough to land or ditch than a Zero pilot in the same situation. Grumman did not build a plane that won fights. They built a plane that kept pilots alive so they could fight again. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate engineering philosophy, and its implications were systemic. Every Hellcat pilot who survived a combat engagement could be debriefed, retrained on his mistakes, and returned to his carrier within days or weeks. His hard-won combat experience was preserved in the system. The Japanese pilot who flew into a Hellcat's gun sight and caught a .50 caliber burst through his unarmored cockpit was gone. His 600 hours of training, his combat instincts, his pattern recognition, his tactical knowledge, all of it left the system permanently. The Hellcat was a machine designed to protect an investment. The Zero was a machine that consumed its investment on every mission. By mid-1943, the divergence had become structural. Japan had begun the war with approximately 3,000 trained naval aviators at the frontline level. Guadalcanal and the subsequent Solomons campaign had cost them between 600 and 900 of their most experienced pilots. The exact figures are debated, but the order of magnitude is clear from Japanese Navy ministry records. The men who replaced them had shorter training timelines, less combat preparation, and were being asked to fly the same doctrine that had been designed around men with twice their experience. In response to the pilot shortage, the Japanese Navy reduced the training pipeline from 600 hours to 316 hours.
Then, as the crisis deepened, to under 200 hours. By early 1944, some replacement pilots were reaching frontline squadrons with fewer than 100 hours total flight time.
The Americans noticed this in the air. Hellcat pilots returning from engagements in late 1943 began reporting that Japanese pilots were making fundamental errors, breaking off engagements they should have pressed, misjudging the Hellcat's dive acceleration, failing to adapt when their initial attack was countered. The tone in after-action reports shifted. The enemy was still flying Zeros. But the men flying them were not the men who had attacked Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, by June 1944, the United States Navy had 891 aircraft embarked on 15 carriers for Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, was the most powerful carrier force ever assembled to that point in the Pacific War. Its Hellcat squadrons were composed of pilots who had accumulated between 300 and 600 hours of flight time, had been trained under a standardized curriculum that incorporated lessons from every previous Pacific engagement, and had received specific briefings on Japanese attack formations, Zero performance envelopes, and the tactical doctrines the IJNAF had been using since 1942. The Japanese response was known as Operation A-Go. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa organized a carrier striking force composed of 9 vessels, which carried a total of 430 aircraft. These included A6M Zeros, D4Y Judy dive bombers, and B6N Jill torpedo bombers. Ozawa's plan was to launch his aircraft at extended range, beyond the effective strike range of Mitcher's carriers, and allow them to attack Task Force 58, then land at Guam and Tinian to refuel and rearm before attacking again. The plan exploited the Zero's superior range and was theoretically sound. There was one problem. The Americans had radar. At 10 a.m. on June 19, 1944, the radar operators aboard USS Lexington detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft at a range of 150 miles, inbound from the west. The intercept controllers on Lexington had approximately 80 minutes to vector Hellcat squadrons to altitude before the Japanese reached the fleet. They used every minute. Mitcher's carriers turned into the wind and began launching fighters at 10:23 a.m. By the time the first Japanese wave crossed the outer picket destroyers, more than 450 Hellcats were airborne and positioned at altitude, waiting. What happened next took approximately 4 hours. The first Japanese wave, 69 aircraft, was intercepted 70 miles from the fleet. The Hellcats had altitude advantage, speed from the dive, and communications. Pilots were receiving real-time vector corrections from radar controllers who could see exactly where the Japanese formations were. The Zero pilots, flying in the pre-war formation doctrine that required radio silence to maintain formation integrity, had no such picture. They could see what was in front of them. They could not see what was coming from above and behind. Ensign Wilbur B. Webb, flying with VF-2 off USS Hornet, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in this engagement. He was 22 years old and had been in the Navy for 18 months. The first wave lost 42 of its 69 aircraft before it reached the fleet. The 27 aircraft that broke through achieved essentially nothing. Minor damage to 1 battleship. No carriers struck. The second wave was larger, 128 aircraft. They fared worse proportionately. Radar tracked them from 115 miles out. The intercept was coordinated across multiple carrier groups. Hellcat pilots reported that Japanese formations were visibly confused. Some aircraft breaking formation, some pressing independently, some apparently uncertain of their target assignment. 62% of the second wave was shot down. The third wave, 47 aircraft, was partially misdirected by navigational error and lost its way entirely. Most was shot down or crashed while attempting to find their targets. The fourth wave suffered similar results. By 4 p.m., the accounting was complete. Japan had launched 373 carrier aircraft. Of those, 243 were shot down in air combat. Another 72 were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire or crashed while attempting to land on damaged fields. Total losses: 315 aircraft, plus the 50 land-based aircraft that Japanese forces at Guam committed to the battle. American losses: 23 aircraft in air combat, 6 more lost to operational causes. The ratio was 10.9 to 1. Mitcher's pilots, returning to their carriers in the late afternoon, were joking on the radio. One of the first transmissions recorded by USS Bunker Hill's communications officer was a pilot saying, almost offhandedly, that it had been like a turkey shoot out there. The phrase moved through the fleet within hours. The after-action reports filed that evening by squadron commanders across Task Force 58 used variations of the same language. One-sided, almost effortless, a harvest rather than a battle. The phrase stuck because it was accurate in a specific and brutal way. A turkey shoot is not a test of skill between equals. It is a test of logistics. How many turkeys are in the field, where they are, who can see them first. The turkeys do not know they are in a turkey shoot until it is too late. The Japanese pilots who flew into the radar-guided intercept on June 19th were brave, and many of them were skilled enough to be dangerous. But they were flying into a system that had been specifically engineered at every level to kill them efficiently. They had no radar picture, they had no altitude advantage, they had no armor when the 50 calibers found them. Their formation doctrine assumed radio silence, so they flew blind relative to each other. Their aircraft were light and fast and burned when hit. Their replacements were 19-year-olds with 100 hours in the cockpit. The outcome was not determined on June 19th. It was determined in 1940 when Japan chose to build a perfect weapon that required a perfect warrior, and America chose to build a weapon that worked with the warriors it could produce in volume. Let me show you what this looks like in the comparison that matters: the A6M Zero versus the F6F Hellcat. Not on a manufacturer specification sheet. In the operational conditions that defined Pacific carrier warfare in 1944. Start with pilot survivability. The Zero had 0 cockpit armor and non-self-sealing tanks. A single .50 caliber round hitting the fuel system created a fire that was essentially unsurvivable at combat altitude. A single burst through the cockpit area had a high probability of killing or incapacitating the pilot. The Hellcat had 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot's head, torso, and seatback. Its fuel system could absorb multiple hits and continue functioning. Hellcat pilots routinely returned to their carriers with dozens of bullet holes in their aircraft. Zero pilots rarely survived the same level of punishment. The survivability gap was not just humanitarian, it was strategic. Every Hellcat pilot who landed with a damaged aircraft could describe precisely what had happened, where the Zero had attacked from, what maneuver had been used, how fast the engagement had developed. That information was debriefed, analyzed, and fed back into training. The knowledge base grew with every engagement. The Japanese pilot who didn't come back took his knowledge with him. Now look at training hours per new pilot. In June 1944, the average Hellcat pilot going into combat had logged approximately 350 flight hours, of which 90 were in the F6F itself, with specific combat training against simulated Zero tactics. The average Japanese pilot arriving at a frontline squadron in June 1944 had logged between 80 and 120 total hours. This is not a guess. The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which conducted detailed interrogations of surviving Japanese naval aviation commanders, documented the collapse of training hours across 1943 and 1944, with specific figures from Japanese Navy records. Now look at radar integration. Task Force 58 had a combat information-centered doctrine that had been refined through 2 years of Pacific combat. Radar operators were trained to identify and track multiple incoming formations simultaneously. Fighter directors were trained to manage intercepts across multiple squadrons in real time. The Hellcats had reliable radios that worked at combat altitude. The Japanese had no equivalent radar-directed intercept system, and their formation doctrine, designed for an era when radio emissions would betray position, actually prevented real-time coordination between pilots during the engagement. Now look at production replacement rates. Between January and June 1944, American industry delivered 6,117 F-6F Hellcats. In the same period, Japanese industry delivered approximately 1,200 Zero variants. Every aircraft lost at the Philippine Sea could be replaced by an American carrier within weeks. Japan had no equivalent replacement capacity. The aircraft that went down over the Philippine Sea were gone. The men who flew them were gone. And the production line and training pipeline that might have replaced them were running 6 months behind demand and falling further behind every month. The Zero was superior in one dimension, low-speed horizontal agility, and in no other dimension that determined survival in the combat environment of 1944. It could outturn a Hellcat. It could not survive being shot at. It could not be replaced. Its pilot could not be replaced. Its pilot could not see what was coming until it was too late. Its pilot had 100 hours in the cockpit. The math was not close. The scale of what Task Force 58 represented is worth sitting with for a moment. 15 carriers, 891 embarked aircraft, 7 fleet carriers, each carrying between 35 and 90 aircraft. Pilots were drawn from a training pipeline that had produced 30,000 combat aviators in 1943 alone. The entire industrial infrastructure of a continent-spanning economy was mobilized specifically to produce aircraft, engines, fuel, ammunition, and trained pilots faster than any opposing force could destroy them. The pre-war Japanese planning assumptions had accepted a loss exchange ratio of approximately 1-to-1 with American forces, with Japan compensating through pilot quality and aircraft performance. That assumption was based on 1940 data, evaluated against American forces equipped with F-4F Wildcats and P-40 Warhawks, flown by pilots trained on the pre-expansion American curriculum. By June 1944, every element of that assumption had been invalidated. The Hellcat replaced the Wildcat. The trained pilot pool had expanded 250 times.
The aircraft that Japan's doctrine assumed could be destroyed by superior agility was now flown by pilots who had been specifically trained to deny the agility engagement.
Hellcat combat doctrine in 1944 was built on a single principle: never turn with a Zero. Dive, fire, use the speed advantage on the way out, and come back for another pass from altitude. The Americans had designed an entire operational philosophy around the Zero's strengths, and then systematically denied those strengths every time they engaged. Vice Admiral Ozawa, in his post-war interrogation by United States Strategic Bombing Survey examiners, was asked to account for the losses of June 19th. His answer was precise and without self-pity. He said that his pilots had been inadequately trained, that his aircraft had been inferior in defensive survivability, and that the American radar system had denied his formations the element of surprise that the attack doctrine required. He said that none of these were surprises to him. He had submitted recommendations to the Navy Ministry in 1943, warning that the training pipeline collapse would produce catastrophic results. The recommendations had been noted. He then said something that military historians have quoted in nearly every serious account of the battle. After this battle, the Japanese Navy was not able to conduct any more large-scale carrier operations. That is not the admission of a defeated man making excuses. That is the statement of a professional who had watched a system designed for a specific set of conditions fail catastrophically when those conditions changed, and who understood precisely why. Ozawa's aircraft had been designed to be flown by men who spent 3 years learning to fly them perfectly. When those men were gone, the aircraft had no margin for the less perfect pilot. The Hellcat had been designed to be flown by men who spent 18 months learning the essentials. When those men were hit, they came home. When they were lost, replacements arrived within weeks, trained to the same standard on an improved curriculum that included every lesson the lost pilot had contributed to the knowledge base before he died. This is the philosophical verdict that emerges from the Philippine Sea. The Japanese built a weapon system that expressed a specific idea about excellence, that the greatest weapon is the one perfected for the ideal operator, and that the ideal operator is defined by eliminating everyone who does not meet the standard. It was an aristocratic theory of military power: fewer, better, irreplaceable. The Americans built a weapon system that expressed a different idea: that the greatest weapon is the one that keeps its operator alive long enough to get better, and that the ideal operator is defined by surviving long enough to accumulate experience. It was a democratic theory of military power. More survivable, replaceable, improvable. In 1942, the aristocratic theory was winning. The Zero pilots were devastating. The American pilots knew they were outmatched in a turning fight, and frequently said so. By June 1944, the aristocratic theory had run out of aristocrats. The Americans called it a turkey shoot. The phrase was accurate, but it missed the deeper irony. The turkeys were not the Japanese pilots. The Japanese pilots who flew on June 19th were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, with exactly what they had been given. The turkey was the doctrine. The turkey was the idea that you could build a weapon system that depended on irreplaceable human perfection in a war fought at industrial scale against an enemy that had decided perfection was secondary to survival. The mockery implicit in the nickname was always misplaced.
What happened in the skies over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, was not the destruction of inferior pilots by superior ones. It was the destruction of a philosophy by its opposite.
And the men who flew those Zeros trained in the final months of a collapsed pipeline on 100 hours of instruction, reaching for the same standard that 600-hour veterans had set in 1942, deserved better from the system that sent them there. The Hellcat didn't win because it was a better aircraft. It won because it was built for a different kind of war, the kind where you lose pilots and replace them, lose aircraft and replace them, lose engagements and learn from them, and keep fighting until the mathematics of attrition turn decisively in your favor. By the end of June 19, 1944, the mathematics had been settled. Japan would never again mount a large-scale carrier air operation. The Philippine Sea was not just a battle, it was the end of Japanese naval aviation as a strategic force. The aircraft were gone. The pilots were gone. The doctrine built around their irreplaceable excellence was gone. And the production pipeline and training infrastructure that might have rebuilt them were running 2 years behind a war that had already been decided. Here is my question for you. We tend to celebrate the perfected weapon, the Zero, the Tiger, the precision instrument built to a demanding standard. But history has a consistent answer when precision meets scale. The turkey shoot is not an accident. It is a design outcome. Have you seen other moments in history where a doctrine built around irreplaceable excellence collapsed against a system built for mass survivability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and the best observations usually spark the next video. If this changed how you see the Pacific Air War, or how you think about what military excellence actually means, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that goes past the myth and into the mechanism. Thanks for watching.